of the canyons. It's so great to have you here, whether you are watching us on Zoom or watching us on Facebook live streaming. It is really an honor to host an event like this, and especially this particular session featuring a very, very special speaker who is not only a prolific documentary photographer based in New York, but also someone who grew up right here in Southern California, in Valencia, who graduated from AOC, the Academy of the Canyons, not the AOC, the young congresswoman from New York. On our theme is this year is migration. And it is really because of migration that we get to have a speaker like the one we have for this session, because our speaker is Haruka Sakaguchi, and she's right here on Zoom. She was born in Osaka, Japan. By the way, Osaka is the second largest city in Japan, right next to another beautiful town called Kobe, which is where I was born and raised. Of course, Kobe is more than just beef. But anyway, Haruka moved from Japan to the United States when she was 3 months old because of her parents' job. And I believe she'll be talking a little bit about her childhood here in the Santa Clarita Valley. And maybe even about her Saturday Japanese school that she used to attend every Saturday. But she is now based in Brooklyn, New York, and she's documenting cultural identity and the sense of place in her photography works, some of which have appeared in some of the well-known publications, such as the New York Times. I believe it's a newspaper company on the East Coast. You may have heard of that company. National Geographic, the Time magazine, the New Yorker, the Smithsonian magazine, Newsweek, and the Washington Post. It is quite an impressive list. But today she'll be talking about this project 1945. This project in particular is on victims of atomic bombs dropped in Japan, and it's especially moving and sort of personal to me. My mother was an 11-year-old girl growing up in an island in the prefecture of Ehime, which borders the prefecture of Hiroshima. I don't think Haruka knew that my mother was from that small island next to Hiroshima. But on August 6, 1945, she had some friends who lived in Hiroshima. And my mother used to talk about some of her friends who lost loved ones and suffered great losses because of the very first nuclear bomb dropped on a town. So this project was recognized internationally, having been on display at the Nobel Peace Center in Oslo, Norway, from 2017 to 2018. So without further ado, please help me welcome Haruka Sakaguchi.
Thank you so much, Sab, for the warm introduction. And I had no idea until this webinar actually about your background and the kind of survivor's guilt that your mother may have felt or talked about. That's something that a lot of the hibakusha have referred to. So again, I'm very excited to be here and share my project with you all. If you can just bear with me for 1 second while I share my screen. And if you can just let me know when you see a slide that says my name and documentary photographer, great. So like Sab mentioned, my name is Haruka Sakaguchi, and I'm a Japanese documentary photographer based here in New York City. I was born in Osaka, Japan, and I was raised partially in New Jersey and partially in California. But during my senior year in high school, I decided to enroll in the Academy of the Canyons, AOC. And there I met incredible teachers who shaped the foundation, I think, of my interest in journalism, including Miss Darren Hoisington, my English teacher, who really instilled in me this instinct to seek answers for contemporary issues in history and journalism. And Mr. Robert Walker, who offered the first time ever human rights course, which was not a common course offering back then, during my time there in AOC. So needless to say, it feels like a full circle moment to be here with you all today, despite these truly strange times that we're living in. And as Saab touched upon, today I wanted to share with you all my first ever documentary project, 1945, which addresses atomic bomb survivors, or what we call who we call hibakusha in Japanese, in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. This project is close to my heart, not only because it was my first published project as a documentary photographer, but because it also taught me that my bicultural identity, my identity rooted in both Japan and the US, really helped me see a historical blind spot that can shift public conversation. You see, throughout my childhood, I felt that my immigrant status was a kind of handicap. I felt inadequate whenever I got pulled out of regular class, where all the American kids were, to go to ESL class, where the immigrant kids went. I felt alienated whenever strangers would come up to me and ask, well, where are you from? You know, despite the fact that I've lived here for most of my life. I was ashamed of my unapologetically Japanese name, which most people have trouble with off the bat. And, but, you know, working on 1945, it helped me truly understand that my bicultural identity is not only an asset, but a necessity in this increasingly polarized world that we live in. You know, if you end up sleeping through the rest of this presentation, I just want you to remember this one thing, that every single one of you sitting with me here today are a gift to this country, and your unique perspectives and worldviews are what is going to help us build a more empathetic and a more equitable future. I began the 1945 project in the spring of 2017. At this point, I had been photographing, you know, small jobs here and there, but I had no contacts in the photojournalism industry, nor did I have any funding or any guarantee that this project was going to be published. All I had was an extra week that I'd booked in Nagasaki after a translating gig that I had booked in Japan. So working with such a low budget, I stayed at a motel that happened to be inundated with construction workers who were working on a nearby development at the time. And I remember the entrance was littered with cigarettes and trash, and my room smelled like a dive bar at 2 a.m. I'd done quite a few solo trips in my life at this point, but that first night in Nagasaki was probably one of the loneliest nights of my life. But the next morning, I visited all of the hibakusha councils and the nonprofit organizations that weren't being really responsive to my desperate emails from abroad back in the US, you know, hoping that maybe if they met me in person, right? Maybe if I dropped in person, that something will change. But I quickly learned that most of these organizations don't take kindly to people dropping in unannounced. And I ended up walking myself to the peace statue in Nagasaki, feeling kind of dejected with nothing to really show for my trip for this extra week that I'd booked in Nagasaki. You see, the peace statue is very much on the tourist circuit. So when I'd arrived, there was a large group of tourists who were laughing and taking selfies with their selfie sticks. And as I continued to sit there, you know, with nothing better to do, really, I began to notice that amongst the crowds of tourists, there were several locals, I presumed, who were arriving solo, just individually, with juzu, or prayer beads, in their hands. And what they would do is they would skip the chaos in front of this peace statue, and they'd head over to a smaller memorial across the street. So after hours of people watching, I'd say I was sitting there for about 4 hours, I finally mustered up the courage to approach one of these people and was lucky enough to meet Miss Kakita, who happened to be a second generation hibakusha who worked at the nearby hibakusha council building. She was gracious enough to invite me into the office and hear me out regarding this project that I had in mind. That week, she introduced me to 8 hibakusha. So clearly this isn't the most efficient way to do things. You know, the smarter thing to do was to get maybe a grant beforehand or maybe some type of institutional backing. So you know that this project is going to get published one day. But the thing is, I had been applying to grants and I had been reaching out to cultural institutions, but none of them bit. I mean, it was probably due mostly to my lack of experience or prestige or a combination of both. But as of spring of 2017, I had a project that no one cared about. So why did I put myself through rejection after rejection, right? Through these, smoky motel rooms to work on this project? Well, it was because as a Japanese immigrant brought up under the US public education system, I often felt conflicted when we covered the end of World War II in history class. You see, the atomic bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki was often treated as this dramatic and climactic end to a chapter, an end to a chapter, right? Followed by a fresh new chapter that was maybe the Korean War or the Cold War. But what happened in between? As a Japanese individual, I grew up vaguely hearing about the residents in Hiroshima and Nagasaki who had suffered keloid scars after the bomb. I grew up hearing about the women who were told not to go out in public because of visible injuries on their face. I read about the US occupation that followed soon after, where GHQ troops had flooded Japanese cities and spent 1/3 of Japan's federal budget housing their own troops amidst mass homelessness and starvation after the war. I was deeply conflicted when I also read that the Supreme Commander of the GHQ mentioned before a joint committee of the US Senate that his actions in Japan were justified because, quote, the Oriental mind was predisposed to adulate a winner. I felt torn because while I felt protective over my home country, that's Japan, I also recognized the deep irony that I had grown up here in the US and that the US was my adopted home country. But at the same time, I felt that the way the atomic bomb was contextualized as this necessary evil, almost a logical conclusion to the deadliest war in human history, didn't do the Hibakusha stories justice. So I wanted to find a way to depict the lived experiences of Hibakusha and their descendants today. So the first Hibakusha that I had the pleasure of meeting was Mr. Yoshiro Yamawaki. Mr. Yamawaki was 11 years old when he was exposed to the bomb in Nagasaki. He and his brothers survived the bomb, but later discovered their father's body near the factory that he worked at. They watched in horror as massive piles of bodies were being dumped into a nearby cremation site. Mr. Yamawaki and his brothers, none of whom were older than 16 at this point, mustered up the strength to give their father a proper cremation, under the care of family members, as opposed to being dumped into a nearby cremation site, right in front of the factory where they found him. Here's an excerpt from his handwritten letter, which I had asked each Hibakusha to prepare in advance as a message to future generations. I have resigned to the fact that nuclear weapons will not be abolished during the lifetime of us first generation Hibakusha survivors. I pray that younger generations will come together to work toward a world free of nuclear weapons. And this is Miss Michiko Yagi, who was also implicated by the bomb in Nagasaki. And while many Hibakusha, like Mr. Yamawaki, who we just heard from, had suffered horrendous experiences directly after the bombing, Miss Yagi spoke extensively about the poverty that she and her family had experienced for nearly 10 years after the war. She reminisced going shopping with her mother, that is, going around begging for food at nearby farms in exchange for her mother's cherished kimonos, these heirloom kimonos, to keep her and her family from starving. She tells a poignant story about how she and her mother once approached a farm to trade her kimonos for some potatoes. When the farmer rejected the offer, her mother quietly pulled the furoshiki cover over her kimonos and she bowed deeply, saying, "Thank you for your time. I will return at a later date." Miss Yagi remembers that her mother always maintains this air of eloquence and calm disposition, even during trying times. Still, she was a child back then, so Miss Yagi was furious and said, "But the farmer had so many, Mama." She then peered up at her mother's face and saw a look of indescribable sorrow and defeat. A look, she says, that she'll never forget. Ms. Yagi's letter reads, "The site of the bombing, Matsuyama Machi, is now a pristine park. Back then, however, it was a bustling town where many people lived and worked. A single atomic bomb detonated 500 meters above this town, destroying everything underneath it. Homes and families disappeared in an instant. Humans cause war, thus only humans can prevent it. I long for a peaceful society where everyone can live with dignity and die with dignity. Peace is not something that we passively wait for. Peace is something that we must seek out and cultivate." Dear reader, please make Nagasaki the last atomic bomb site. Yagi, Michiko. And this is Mr. Fujio Torikoshi, who passed away last June. He was exposed to the atomic bomb in Hiroshima and suffered severe burns. So he spent weeks drifting in and out of consciousness in the hospital due to these injuries. But he finally woke to his mother sitting beside his bed, playing a lullaby on her harmonica. Mr. Torikoshi has since become a teacher, and he's presented his testimony to thousands of students in Japan, concluding each talk with a song from his harmonica. Back then, when he was still being hospitalized, he was told that he had until age 20 to live. Mr. Torikoshi was 86 years old when he passed away. His letter reads, "Life is a curious treasure." This is Mr. Yasujiro Tanaka, who was 3 years old at the time of the bombing. He was buried alive under the house, but miraculously saved by his uncle who pulled him out of the debris. Still, his face was misshapen and he lost hearing in his left ear, probably due to the air blast. More than a decade after the bombing, his mother discovered glass shards growing out of her skin. This was more than a decade after the bombing. What she could only presume as debris from the day of the bombing. His sister suffers chronic muscle pain and kidney issues to this day that has her on dialysis 3 times a week. "What did I do to the Americans?" he recalls her saying over and over. "Why did they do this to me?" Mr. Tanaka's letter reads, "You're only given one life, so cherish this moment, cherish this day, be kind to others, be kind to yourself." And this is Miss Taiko Teramai, who was exposed to the bomb in Hiroshima when she was in high school. Her lifelong dream was to become a teacher, but she decided against it due to the injuries that she had incurred on her face during the bombing. I can speak about Ms. Teramai's experiences, but I would like to share an audio clip where she speaks about her own experiences in her own words after the bombing.
こういうのを 怪我をした顔を毎日毎日見られながら生きていくのは考えもんだなと思って、あっさりと家でできることだけをしながら生きていこう思って、進学何いうことは思わんと、とにかくのっこいも働きに行かないということはちょっと考えものではありましたけど、元気でおればいいけど、また原爆症とかいろんな病気にかかっていくんだったら、このままもうおらん方がいいよなと思うようになったのは、やはり
So I wanted to close with this portrait of Miss Kumiko Arakawa, who was exposed to the bomb when she was 20 years old in Nagasaki. She lost 6 members of her family due to the bombing and was suddenly required to support her younger siblings single-handedly as a 20-year-old. She told me that she has no recollection of the day of the bombing or even how she was able to put her siblings through school. When asked to write a message for future generations, she replied, "Nani mo omoitsukanai," or "I can't think of anything." In total, I had the opportunity to photograph and interview 52 hibakusha, like Miss Arakawa, over the span of 2 years, making 2 to 3 trips to Japan a year. What was initially a series of portraits like what you just saw eventually evolved into a dedicated website complete with not only the portraits, but also audio files like what you just heard, educational resources, and a historical timeline. So let's walk through the website. Can everyone see the front page of the website that says 1945? Wonderful.
Yes.
So as you can see, this is the front page. We have a short introduction here that reads, on August 6th and 9th, 1945, the US dropped 2 atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki respectively, killing between 129,000 to 226,000 people by the end of the year. Many suffer from debilitating diseases and stigmatization to this day. And as of 2018, which was when this project was completed, the average age of hibakusha, or atomic bomb survivors, is 81.41. Soon, we will no longer be able to hear first-hand accounts of this human atrocity. So down here, you're able to view the gallery, of which I think 7 of which we were able to go through just now. And as you can see, when you hover over each hibakusha, you can get a sense of, you can get their name, what generation hibakusha they are, their location, and an excerpt from their translated letter. And you could probably see here, we have many first generation from both Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But down here, we also have testimonies from second generation from Hiroshima and Nagasaki, extending down to the 3rd and 4th generation in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And I was able to build out the website so that when you click on each portrait, you're taken to this an individual site where you can get a sense of their profile. So again, their name, their age, their location, and the distance from the hypocenter, the ground zero of the atomic bomb, followed by the translation of the letter that you're seeing here to the right. And then this testimony, which is an excerpt from what was supposed to be an hour-long interview, which usually turned into 2 or 3 hours. But I was able to get an excerpt from these interviews that I was able to conduct and translate a portion of it to English so that visitors could get an idea of each hibakusha's individual story. And we also have the historical timeline here, which was a significant part of the website that I really wanted to build in from the beginning of kind of conceptualizing this project to offer some background context as to what historical events had culminated to the dropping of the atomic bomb. And this timeline spans 14 years from the Manchurian incident to 1945 when the 2 bombs were dropped in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And I know we don't have a lot of time to, so this is a whole history lesson in itself. I would love for you to, if you ever have time, if you ever get a chance to go through this entire timeline. But today I was hoping maybe I could walk us through some of the incidents leading up to the year 1945, which is what this project was named after. So as you can see here, we have the timeline starts in 1931, the September 18th of 1931, actually, when there was a small explosion near a railway line that was owned by Japan's South Manchuria Railway in Mukden, China. And the Imperial Japanese Army had claimed that Chinese rebels had detonated a bomb. And they proceeded to invade, kind of use that as an excuse to invade Manchuria, ignoring the central government's orders to localize and investigate the incident. So when the international community had unveiled Japan's involvement in this so-called incident and had urged Japan to restore Manchuria to Chinese sovereignty, that was when Japan left the League of Nations, which kind of translated into their continued presence in Chinese provinces, and also another incident known as the Marco Polo Bridge incident, which sparks the Second Sino-Japanese War in July. And after invading Shanghai, Japanese troops marched to Nanking, during which episodes of mass murder and rape began. One of the most infamous atrocities was the Hakuninggiri killing contest, a race between 2 Japanese officers to see which officer could kill 100 people first using only a sword. And this was covered very much like a sporting event on a Japanese newspaper with the regular updates over several days. The massacre continued for over 6 weeks after the fall of Nanking, which resulted in 40,000 to 300,000 estimated deaths. And you may notice that that is a huge range of numbers. The death toll varies widely this way because Japanese military officials hid and destroyed records on the massacre after Japan's surrender in 1945. And this issue still remains very much a stumbling block in Sino-Japanese relationships to this day. And in 1938, the Japanese Imperial Army began a terror bombing campaign in Chongqing in February, conducting over 268 air raids over a period of 5 years. In March, the Japanese government issued an ordinance that required schools in Korea to teach Japanese as an official language. And in April, the government implemented the National Mobilization Law, which conscripted farmers and civilian workers in Japan to transition into war industry. So essentially we had, farmers who were now forced to work in factory assembly lines, maybe making parts to military plane aircrafts. And the combination of this, increasingly demanding military budget, as you can imagine, and the mass drafting of farm workers led to severe food shortages in Japan, which is often referenced by hibakusha. So a lot of this, even before the bombing, right, the civilians in Japan were suffering mass starvation and mass poverty. And in November, then Prime Minister Fumimaro Konoe had introduced the concept of a new order in East Asia, implying that Japanese conquest is necessary to, quote, free Asia from European colonial powers. So as you can imagine, starting in 1939, the tensions were mounting, right? The Japanese Imperial Army occupied Hainan Island to complete its southern blockade of China from outside imports. And Japanese forces had continued the terror operation in Chongqing, killing over 5,000 Chinese civilians in a 2-day period in May of 1939. And in response to this, the US embargoed airplane parts to Japan, thus implementing its first economic sanction in Japan. So this is when the US enters the stage and becomes kind of entrenched and involved in this timeline here. In 1941, we see the Pacific War begins. The Imperial Japanese Army continued its quest to halt arms and fuel imports into China and started to invade Indochina. And to keep from having to fight a multi-front war, Japan then decides to sign a neutrality pact with the Soviet Union for the duration of World War II, which we all know dissolves at one point. But the US, concerned about Japan's expansion into Saigon and Hanoi, now escalated their first economic sanction into a full embargo on exports to Japan and froze Japanese assets in US banks. So in response, then Prime Minister Fumimaro Konoe had proposed a meeting with President Franklin D. Roosevelt, wanting to form or maybe revisit kind of diplomatic relations between the two countries, but he received no formal reply. And during the month of November, Japan offered 2 diplomatic proposals, once again, to the American government. However, the US rejected both after Roosevelt received a leak that a Japanese fleet was on its way to Indochina. On November 26th of this year, Secretary of State Cordell Hull presented a Japanese ambassador with the Hull Note, with the historically significant Hull Note, which required Japan to completely withdraw its troops from French Indochina and China. And then Prime Minister Tojo Hideki called this note an ultimatum, as he felt that it wholly disregarded, his past 2 proposals. So on December 7th, the Imperial Japanese Navy Air Service attacked a US naval base in Pearl Harbor, which many of us know about, killing 2,403 military persons and 68 civilians, at which point the US declared war on Japan the following day, on December 8th. So ever since in the US, the element of uranium was discovered, or uranium fission, this process was discovered in 1938, they had started to set up multiple committees for the further development of nuclear weapons. And with the US now at war, funding was now available at an unprecedented level. So we have that on the US side. Meanwhile, in Japan, they were suffering acute food and labor shortages, and to the point where they had to draft the Kyosei Renko in February 1942, which was a way to enforce Korean laborers to Japan. And in the same month, the US incarcerated up to 120,000 people of Japanese ancestry, 62% of which were US citizens. And 4 months later, Japan lost a decisive naval battle at the Battle of Midway, where their naval fleet suffered irreparable damage. And this was followed by another Japanese defeat in the Battle of Bunagona and another defeat in the Battle of Batu. So as you can imagine, in Japan, things weren't going very well. Yet, Japanese newspapers continued to claim that the nation was nearing victory, while mass evacuations and conscription programs had continued. But you see, in 1943 to 1944 here, there are multiple attempts for Japan to save face, right? First, to offset labor shortages, the Japanese government conducted a mass drafting of students into war industries in June of 1943. In November, the Japanese government held the Greater East Asia Conference in a meager, weak attempt to reinforce this Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere, this new East Asia order that we were talking about earlier, where the participants, and if you listen closely here, the participants were head of states from the 6 independent states of Manchukuo, the reorganized national government of China, state of Burma, the Second Philippine Republic, the Provisional Government of Free India, and there was an envoy from the Kingdom of Thailand. So you could probably tell that, you know, this was not the most stable bunch of state leaders. And while Japan was kind of trying to save face in these ways, they were suffering, you know, mounting civilian casualties under the US air attacks. And they were already calling for mass evacuations into the countryside in 1944, while nuclear research continued on in the US. And then the year 1945. So the reason why I named this project after this year was because it really showed the multi-dimensionality of the events that culminated into the dropping of the atomic bombs. The year 1945 is remembered differently in every country. You know, for the Japanese, it's the year of unprecedented devastation and the dual voice broadcast, where the emperor spoke directly to his subjects for the first time, right? Before then, for many centuries, you know, the civilians, Japanese civilians, had almost kind of attributed the emperor as this almost divine figure. And if you can imagine hearing this divine figure's voice in the flesh for the first time over the radio, saying that the war was over and that they had lost, it was a year of significant loss and devastation for the Japanese. For Americans, 1945 is the year when World War II was punctuated by the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which had effectively curtailed many more American and Japanese deaths. And for those in Manchuria, 1945 is the year when governing hands abruptly switched from the Imperial Japanese Army to Soviet-backed communist regimes, resulting in tens of thousands of war-displaced people and orphans. And for many other Asian nations, 1945 is the year of liberation from Japanese colonial rule and brutalities. So again, I would love to go through the rest of this, but this will this is a lesson, or this is a presentation in and of itself. So the historical timeline, it goes through the year 1945 in depth here, and talk about the events that led up to the bombing, the Yalta Conference, the Potsdam Declaration, for example, followed by the bombing of Hiroshima and the bombing of Nagasaki. So if you're interested, please feel free to visit this portion of the website. And yeah, another important part of the website here are the audio files. So like the audio clip that we were able to hear from Ms. Taiko Teramai here. We have a few more audio clips here that are stored here on the website. They're all, you know, about 5-minute segments from the interviews that I was able to conduct with the hibakusha. And the last portion of this website is, a page where site readers, site visitors can get an idea of how they can contribute to this collective effort that's spearheaded by ICANN, the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, on ratifying the UN Nuclear Ban Treaty. So yeah, it was just a quick walkthrough of the website. As Saab was had kindly mentions, this project has been featured on Time. It was featured on Time on August 6th of 2017, and it was on display at the Nobel Peace Center in Oslo from November 2017 to 2018. And I was also able to collaborate with the 2017 Nobel Peace Prize recipient ICANN, the organization International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons that I mentioned earlier, to build a separate website that tells the stories of individual hibakusha, which went live this year. And for those of you who may not know, ICANN is a coalition of non-governmental organizations in 100+ countries promoting adherence to the United Nations Nuclear Weapon Ban Treaty. Since 2007, ICANN has successfully lobbied for a legally binding agreement to prohibit nuclear weapons and have organized awareness programs to educate the public on the human impacts of nuclear weapons. And I'm proud to say that on October 24th of this year, which is only weeks ago, the UN Nuclear Ban Treaty had reached the required 50 states for its entry into force, cementing, kind of categorical ban on nuclear weapons, which is a historical milestone, as you can imagine, 75 years after these hibakusha's lives were altered irreversibly. So I like to think that, the 1945 project had a very small part in this collective effort to stigmatize and prohibit the use of nuclear weapons. So ultimately, the reason why this project got the feedback that it did, as much as I'd like to think it was because of my fantastic photography skills, it's because the hibakusha story was a historical blind spot. It was largely overlooked in American textbooks. Right? Even in Japan, it was covered with an overly historical emphasis, like the hibakusha were these people from the past. It also didn't help that the hibakusha's experiences were handled as classified information for years directly after the war due to the media censorship laws implemented by the US occupation forces. And that silence kind of continued to be perpetuated by workplace and marriage discrimination in Japan, which, as you can imagine, kind of disincentivized or discouraged hibakusha from coming forward about their status, right? And from talking about their health status and their descendants, and so on and so forth. Case in point, many hibakusha refused to apply for this pink booklet called Hibakusha Techo, which gave them access to healthcare subsidies. I would say, sometimes free healthcare, but also kind of identified the holder as a hibakusha. So it was this double-edged sword, right? You could get free healthcare, but when you have this pink booklet, you are now identified as a hibakusha. And some hibakusha refused to apply for this document to protect their families and their descendants from discrimination. Some only gave in and applied for the booklet only when their radiation sickness had worsened to the point where they absolutely had to seek medical help. So even when I started this project in 2017, which was only 3 years ago, there weren't many stories about hibakusha survivors and their descendants. I remember discussing this project with an American colleague who said, "But I thought they all died from the blast." I'm sure you could all imagine the look on my face then. But you know what I also remember? I remember talking with Japanese people who also knew very little about the hibakusha and their multi-generational pain and trauma. I specifically remember talking to a Japanese woman my age who said that she thinks her grandmother is a hibakusha, but she isn't sure. I remember holing up in research libraries in Hiroshima and Nagasaki when I was doing research for this project, right? For hours on end, watching 4-hour-long uncut video testimonies by hibakusha and thinking, well, the hibakusha stories are obviously being documented, but of course no one knows about them. This information was sure as hell not available in the textbooks. And who honestly has time to fly out to Nagasaki and sit through 4-hour-long video testimonies? Every one of us in this room has access to at least 2 different cultures and worldviews, especially international students, 2 different cultures and worldviews. And we understand that the way we interpret the world is different from other Americans, from our friends and colleagues, maybe even our own family members. I want you to tap into this difference tap into this blind spot that you see that others don't. You know, just as I sat there in my middle school history class, visibly upset because I felt that the hibakusha were not rightfully acknowledged, you will or may already have encountered countless instances when truths are manipulated or altogether omitted to make room for a more convenient truth. Hell, as much as I resented my American history teacher for calling the atomic bomb a necessary evil, I'll also be the first to admit that many people in Japan are ignorant about the atrocities that the Japanese inflicted upon other countries during World War II, like we talked about in the historical timeline. Because we spend so much of our history classes learning about medieval Japan while conveniently spending very little time on modern history. In my opinion, the part that really matters. So as you navigate life here in the US, speaking to the international students out there, as you navigate life here in the US, please remember that you are a gift to this country. That your voice is what this deeply fragmented country needs. Don't be afraid to disrupt the dominant narrative. Don't be afraid to complicate the conversation. Because trust me, nuance is something that this country desperately needs. As we close off this turbulent year, I'd like for you to think about the following. What are the experiences that have shaped you? And what blind spots can you see as a result of these experiences? Once you have an idea of the above, I invite you to share your unique insights with the rest of the world, whether in the form of art, literature, storytelling, advocacy work, or even just sharing your story with one other person, and maybe planting a seed in the process. Thank you.
Well, wow. Thank you so much, Haruka. I really appreciate that. I'm sure the audience does as well. I have like 3 questions that came in the chat room, chat space or whatever box. I see people congratulating. So there's a round of applause, even though we can't hear that. So yeah, thank you so much. Yeah. Okay, so the first question came sort of in the middle of our discussion here from a person named AJ. Is there a story or a person that you connected with more than others during all of your interviews?
I would say Miss Michiko Yagi's story, especially the way that she was talking about her mother, and just kind of I could relate to how she had looked up to her mother. She was the one who was going grocery shopping with her mother, visiting all these farms, right, to trade in her cherished kimonos for the potatoes. And you know, the way she spoke about her mother, you could tell that it was just pure adoration. I mean, her mother, like she had described, was had this capacity to always maintain composure and always, you know, have this air of eloquence about her during these trying times. And when she told me about how she had peered up at her face and had just seen her mother, you know, trying to keep this, again, trying to maintain her composure, but you could just see the deep sorrow in her eyes. That story really resonated with me. As you know, obviously a mother, not a mother, as a daughter to a mother, and knowing what that mother-daughter relationship is like and how fundamentally altering that type of experience could be for a child.
Okay, good. And then we had a question from a student, Isabella. Did these interviews change the way you viewed the bombings?
Yes, I think the way that I had learned about the bombings, obviously, you know, it was very topical, right? Just kind of as this logical conclusion, as a necessary evil. That was how I was taught under the US education system. So I think I always had a very politicized view of the atomic bombings. So my approach to it was, I was actually initially scared of starting this project and meeting with hibakusha and introducing myself as a Japanese person who grew up in the US. I thought that I would get a lot of flack for that. I thought some people would not want to share their stories with me just because of the fact that I was from the US. So I had this very overly politicized view of this, but I learned pretty quickly that it's not about politics. I mean, the survivors, their intentions are very singular in the sense that they just want nuclear abolition. They just want these weapons to no longer be a threat to the human race, so no one ever has to experience what they did. And so that I would say that was my largest takeaway from conducting these interviews. Yes.
Good. Well, thank you. And then Brent, our historian, asked a historical question, history question, of course. Do you think war between Japan and the US was inevitable? Or is it possible that between 1939 and 41, both sides might have been actually willing to diplomatically resolve the conflict?
I mean, it's very difficult to I guess speculate in that sense. I think it was inevitable from honestly from the point that Japan left the League of Nations, that I think there was already a huge disruption in the international community that was going to be addressed by a country, whether that was going to be the US or another Western European country. I feel like that was a part of the historical timeline that I really wanted to include because I feel like that was a very pivotal point in both Japan and the rest of the world's kind of individual fates throughout this time period.
Okay, I'm sure you will not be graded on that answer by your history professor here.
I hope he's not watching.
So are there any other questions? Feel free to, we have like 15 minutes or so in which to ask questions. Tim has his hand up. Go ahead,
yes,
unmute yourself whenever. Yep.
So a beautiful presentation, Haruka, and the presentation of your information is also beautiful. It's emotionally compelling mixed in with facts. It's fantastic. It's probably, and I'm certainly not anywhere near an expert, but it's probably the most fantastic presentation like that I've ever seen outside of an actual museum, with millions of dollars of funding. You maybe have created the future museums of the digital age. But the question that I have for you is, with all that emotion that comes out in this, did you find yourself really struggling with your own emotions during the process of post-interview review, or choosing who to put in and who to take out? And how did you manage that emotional quotient for you? Because certainly you can't be numb to it, of course.
Absolutely. It's something that a lot of documentary photographers and photojournalists have been finally kind of talking about nowadays. I think after the pandemic, and we all started thinking internally about, the kind of emotional repercussions of our work. But this concept of secondary trauma, initially, right, like as a photographer, and when I'm conducting these interviews, like I'm hearing these stories, and of course it wears on me, and of course, it's a very lingering effect. But a part of me didn't know how to really process that information, and I also found this pattern of kind of becoming jaded as these interviews were going on, as a coping mechanism. And I really resented that about myself too. But also the fact that, like I wasn't able to process these emotions properly. I was obviously, and still am a very, I'm still very much an emerging photographer, but still back then I was like, this was my first project. So I wasn't really open to the idea of accepting the emotional repercussions as secondary trauma, just because what the survivors had suffered was something that was, I mean, catastrophically different from something that I'm over here just processing these stories and, you know, editing these photos and putting it together on a website. Like, what do I have to be sad about, right? And this is something that I think a lot of photographers go through, but then there would be moments when, you know, you'd be out in public and you start crying out of nowhere, or you can't go to sleep, or you start kind of reaching for other vices to kind of cope for the rest of the project. And you're like, well, obviously something's not right, you know? Yeah, I think, I hope now that photographers are starting to have conversations about secondary trauma, I hope this becomes something that is more openly discussed, and something that is less stigmatized. But back then in 2017, when I was conducting these interviews, yes, it was very difficult. Yeah.
I have another question in the chat box, and so it's from Matt, and it says, do you think the samurai way mentality was at all responsible for the relentless war efforts, for the relentless war efforts of Japan in World War II? I'm asking as a samurai history enthusiast, because it seems to me, mainly after Midway, that Japan knew defeat was inevitable, but giving up was against the beliefs.
So yeah, there's a bit of a gap time-wise between, you know, the Edo period, when samurai were considered the kind of ruling warrior class, versus what we're talking about, World War II. But I would say the mentality of Jukyo, which I'm sure, you know, as a samurai historian, you would be familiar with this mindset that really informs martial arts, right? And also this pure dedication to either the government or the daimyo or whoever your superior is. That regardless of, you know, you would, family ties or your kin or your friends or your own personal beliefs would always be preceded by your commitment to the daimyo or the government or whatever leader that you were. This type of mentality, the Jukyo mentality, I think probably did have an effect on how the Japanese military had grown so out of control during this time period, and how they had become so emboldened to commit these acts, whether or not they had permission from the central government or not.
Yeah, and also, you know, if you think of kamikaze pilots, I mean, basically, it was an honor for them, and they were at least taught that way, that it was an honor to die for the country and for the emperor, and coming back alive. And some of them did come back alive because of aircraft malfunction or whatever, and that was an embarrassment. You know, it's much better to die for your country than to come back alive. So perhaps that is a part of that mentality, you know, that you're talking about. Sort of like what you saw in the movie Last Samurai, you know, there's a certain code that you are to keep and that kind of things. So I have a few more things here. Let's see, what is it? So do you think that the samurai way mentality was actually all responsible? Oh, okay, we just read that. That Japan knew defeat was inevitable, but giving up is against beliefs. Thank you for your response. Yes, I was thinking of the harakiri, the art, or the suicide by, you know, cutting yourself or killing yourself as well. Sorry, I misspelled. So that, yeah, I think that's what I was sort of referring to. You know, just dying for the country is better, and you know, you get honored, you get to be placed on a shrine, memorialized, and almost worshipped after your death at a very famous shrine, as opposed to coming back alive, you know. So okay, any other questions? Go ahead. Yeah, just unmute yourself and speak up. Anyone?
I've got another question. This is Tim. Let's bring it just for a moment back to youth. I'm curious about students that are at the typical college age now of, say, 17 to 25. This portion of Japanese history, is it prevalent in their minds? Or is it this old history from way back before? How does that play a role in their worldview and what they're going to try to accomplish after they graduate?
Mm-hmm. One thing that I'm sure it was kind of exemplified by the quote, the conversation I had with the Japanese woman who was like, I think my grandmother was a hibakusha, right?
Mhm.
That was a very resonant quote for me because it really speaks to the silence around this issue, and that your own grandmother could potentially be a hibakusha, but that's not something that she felt like she maybe she didn't feel like she had the permission to, but she certainly didn't go ahead and pry or to investigate that issue further. So there is a lot of silence and taboo around first generation and second generation hibakusha in Japan in general. But I think if we're talking about the larger context of the war, Japan, after having committed all these atrocities outside of Japan, right? Geographically, we're an isolated island. So if you were to go to, say, here in New York, obviously the Twin Towers, right? That is a place of remembrance for us. And Japan, we only have, in Japan, there's only the atomic bomb sites. The other, countries, you have to leave, you have to purposely leave the country to be able to experience these other places of remembrance in all throughout Asia. And that could be a troubling factor because that means, young people in Japan, unless they make a concerted effort to leave Japan and to seek out these historical events and to learn about these historical events, then all they actually see are, again, Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Even though they were the hypocenters of the atomic bomb, they're still, very much kind of institutionalized now. If you go to Hiroshima, there's a beautiful museum. All the streets are branded in an eerie way, but they're named after, it would be like a Peace Boulevard, or they would have a park that's dedicated. So it's very pristine, and it's a very kind of sterile in a way. You wouldn't really understand the magnitude of the destruction that had happened there unless you really read about it, right? So I feel like in a sense our history has been whitewashed, one, from the way that these areas, Nagasaki and Hiroshima, had been developed afterwards, but second, also the mere facts that we really don't have a lot of these places of remembrance to turn to. Because we're an isolated island, and people would have to make an effort to venture out to these places to learn about what really happened during World War II.
Yeah, so Tim, I was, I was taught in Japan. I grew up there for 15 years. I had my history classes there. And when I came to the American University, I learned the world history here, and they were entirely different. And of course, many of you know, I married a Korean American, and it was extremely difficult to convince her parents that it's okay to marry a Japanese person. In fact, my father-in-law, who's passed away now, but he spoke Japanese fluently. And it's not because he liked Japan, right? Because he learned Japanese as a child because he went to school under the occupied, the Japanese government. His teachers were all Japanese. And so it was really interesting to hear firsthand what happened in, like in the Korean Peninsula. And of course, they had even more tragic events that followed, the 1945, because the country was split into North and South, even to this day. And so my mother-in-law's family actually escaped. Just her and her one of her brothers basically escaped North Korea on foot, to come down to South. So there are lots of things that I didn't know, even after taking courses in both countries. So I'm sure, like Haruka said, it's really important for us to face the truth and see, what happened, why it happened, and these are such great important lessons. I feel like I'm promoting history courses. Maybe I am, but it's great. Yeah. So thank you. Okay. Anybody else? We have a couple more minutes.
I don't have much of a question. I just want you to know how much I love your presentation. And I think that you have heard me and Asabe heard me said many times. I think that if we can bring our students, our faculty to Nagasaki to visit the sites, to visit the Peace Park, I think faculty would change this, have some ideas, better integrate his historical views from different angle, and then sociology professors we can look at the impact, right? How history impacts the society even up to today. And for our students, really not just read about it and then watch it on TV or on any kind of dramatized shows. It's more of when you actually immerse yourself there, that when you sit there for 4 hours under that statue and then the magnitude of it and then the emotional impact just by being there, I think nothing can replace this kind of interconnectedness of humanity than actually visit the site. And then what I really like from the Peace Park and the museum was they want this to be the last atomic bomb that will ever be dropped on Earth. And then that's the goal. And then what I really like about it is non-judgmental. It didn't point fingers to point the Americans or to point anybody else. It just wanted to tell the story from the people's perspective about what it was like at that time. And then that's usually history gets written by the winners, right? And then people who supposedly lose the war don't get to tell the side of the story. And even if it was told, I think sometimes it's so emotion laden, which is necessary, but it doesn't achieve the balanced perspective as much as it should from a higher education perspective. So my goal, and as Ab knows about this, is to organize either one as a form of faculty professional development, to have a group of faculty from multidisciplines to visit Nagasaki. Or in Japan, we can pick a site and we'll work with the university. And then better yet, bring along our students to be able to go to places like that. Because all you do, what you need is you need to change that one person, that one faculty who's willing to teach and talk about it. And then teach that one student. You just never know in the future that students become the future policy maker of the society. And then that's why I truly believe in the power of study abroad. I truly believe in the power of higher education. So I would just, from the sincerity of my heart, I want to thank you for this just beautiful presentation. And then not just the beauty of it, right? It's about who you are. And then so many of our students actually kind of straddled between two worlds, and then multiple generations and multiple languages and the multiple identities. The idea, Gloria Anzaldua's idea of the borderland, right? The borderland of culture, the language, and the history. I think we can help bridge the challenges of borderland by actually bring our students there, bring our faculty there. Thank you.
No, absolutely. Thank you so much for your kind words. I think that's an approach that us photographers are trying to implement as well, the more of a multidisciplinary approach. I think if this project had just kind of stood as a portrait series, then it wouldn't have been able to, be utilized. I have gotten so much feedback from American high school and middle school history teachers, actually. Some of them asking me for permission to use it in their history courses. Others just telling me about the feedback that they've gotten from the students. But that is what makes, I think, our occupation invaluable. It's about the adding the much needed context and nuance in these events that are often overlooked in history. So thank you so much for your kind words.
Thank you. And I assume you'll join us for the scholarly dialogue on Thursday?
Yes, I'll be here.
Okay.
Looking forward to it.
Okay, so this afternoon we have a panel discussion with students. And on Thursday, that's what Jai was just referring to. On Thursday, we will have a panel discussion where the panelists are these speakers, including Haruka and others. We have a great line of domestic and international speakers, and they will all be panelists on Thursday. So I hope you will be able to join us again